Many of the people of the world live in the comfort of structured society. This organization offers them protection from the more primal forces of nature and death that exist just beyond their torchlight. The verdant jungle surrounding the town of Rottagin is a wild place far removed from any semblance of this structure and security. Rottagin is a simple fishing village bordering the Blackwater Inland Sea. Distant from all other civilizations, its dirt roadways and simple wooden structures serving as a sort of island of civilization in a sea of dark green. On a dark dirt road on the edge of town, a small group of young children play a simple game with rocks and leaves, pulling the latter from the abundant branches. "Analia, you need to pick the green ones. Stop picking the dead leaves," says a young girl with neatly tied back blonde hair. "They're all leaves, Ruby. What does it matter?" The girl says, gathering the leaves. She scoffs, her own blonde hair dangling in long braids behind her back, slowly collecting various leaf fibers and twigs as she rummages through the jungle's undergrowth. "The dead ones are gross. Sometimes they get slimy," Ruby said with a slight shudder. "Besides, Mother will be upset if we come home filthy again." "If I don't gather enough, we can't play. Just go help Vivian with the posts," Analia shrugged before continuing deeper into the underbrush with her basket to collect more of these long green leaves that they would need for their game. Ruby, with a sigh, turned to look at their significantly more dirty and clearly less fortunate peasant girl companion that was busying herself with a task of jamming sticks into the dirt, stretching the few leaves that they had already collected and woven between them. With another heavy sigh, Ruby slumped her shoulders and walked over to the girl, careful not to get too close to her, as if she could catch the dirt off of her like a disease. "Vivian, where are you putting the other posts? I thought I could help make the field." Ruby lied. Her sister had told her to help, but she didn't want to. Until now, she had just been standing around waiting for the work to be done so that she could play. Vivian, a filthy girl with long and unkempt black hair, looked up with vibrant violet eyes. "Oh, yeah, we can put the others by the forest, or some over by the wall over there," she muttered sheepishly, pointing out the cobblestone wall of a nearby home. Ruby nodded with an exaggerated smile before collecting the other 3 sets of posts and walking off to set them up. If only Vivian wasn't the only other little girl in town their age, they could choose much better playmates than. She pushed the girl from her mind before resigning herself to delicately sticking the posts into the ground, careful to not get dirt on her sleeves or on the hem of her dress. Vivian watched Ruby as she struggled to set up these posts without getting any of this damp soil on her clothes. She knew that she was beneath the 2 sisters in status. They were daughters of the Lord and Lady. Their days shouldn't be spent with the likes of her. She was but a simple fisherman's daughter, stinking of fish and mud from the Blackwater Sea. It had been months since the Lord and Lady approached her father on their search for a playmate for their daughters. She had simply been the closest girl of their age that was determined to be proper enough mannered to interact with their daughters. Gathering up her sticks, Vivian made her way down the road, just a short way to mark the edge of their playing field, passing Ruby as she did. Ruby flinching away from her again, like she so often did, and Vivian couldn't help but feel a quick stab of self-consciousness. The sisters were always clean and appropriately pampered to maintain their clothes and hair, something that while they did not flaunt, they did also never forget. Vivian would always be careful not to touch them, not willing to risk the money her father received for the time that she spent playing with them. The heat of the day was upon them, and the bright sun shined its light down on the exposed town, making Vivian squint her eyes. And as the damp earth gently steamed, as it crunched beneath her bare feet, she squatted down in the middle of the road, taking to the task of jamming the sticks into the dirt, relishing this fresh earthy scent as she did so. Suddenly a scream rang out from the jumble, startling Vivian as she jumped to her feet, sticks clenched in her dirty hands. "Analia?" Ruby called from her space near the stone wall, standing and holding her dress in both hands. Turning to look back at her, Ruby's eyes were wide with fear for her sister. Vivian, afraid as well, watched as Ruby stared back at the jungle, petrified with fear. Vivian knew the dangers of the jungle. Plenty of creatures lived within its darkness. They had ignored the obvious danger of lingering too close to the jungle's edge. Even now, she could hear the mad scramble of something in the underbrush and the whipping of leaves as something or someone ran for their life. She wanted to help, but knew that she could not. She was just a girl. What could she do against whatever was out there with Analia? She could only picture the beast that must be after her, if it hadn't caught her yet. Sharp fangs and glowing eyes that prowl the night. Another scream rang out, wrenching Vivian from her thoughts. This time it was Ruby, who stood there now screaming at the jungle. In the shadow of the trees, Analia had emerged, standing there in her white dress with a frightened expression. Her body jerked as she coughed, splattering the front of her dress with a deep crimson. Another bloom of blood, like a rose on her chest, began to spread as the tip of a blade protruded from just beneath the cloth. Analia gurgled softly before slumping to the ground, holding her wounded chest. Behind her now stood a beast of a man, or Vivian thought it was a man, holding a shining sword blade stained in a deep red. "Help!" Ruby cried as she turned to run, pushing roughly past Vivian as she fled deeper into town, suddenly no longer as concerned with the dirt that caked the girl. Another creature swiveled out from behind a tree beside the first, loosing an arrow at the fleeing girl, and Vivian could only watch as Ruby too fell to the ground, a large arrow buried deep into her back, screaming the entire way. As the heat of the sun slipped beneath a cloud, and a shadow fell over the road, extending from the shade of the trees like a terrible tidal wave, Vivian stood there, eyes wide as she took in the innumerable creatures creeping just beneath the cover of the jungle, before she too screamed and fled. Fear gripping her heart as it pounded in her chest. She felt an itch between her shoulder blades where she expected an arrow to embed itself, but one never came. Diving into a gap between two houses, she ran around to the back where she knew there was a fallen log beside a massive boulder. Diving beneath it, she cared not for the muck that she sank into, embracing it gladly as it squelched beneath her body. Wriggling deeper and deeper under the log, she found her familiar hiding space beneath the boulder itself. Shedding herself into the confined space, she watched through a tiny gap between the dirt and the rock as these creatures, or men, swarmed from the jungle like angry bees, barking orders through the chaos. Vivian lay squished beneath the rock in her hiding place, frightened and alone in the dark as she heard the sounds of screaming and battle outside of her hiding space. She saw the bright light of burning fire and heard its roar even from underground. "Find them! Bring them here!" she heard a gruff man say. Looking out from her hiding place, she could see the figure of a large man wearing furs over his metallic armor, standing where she had been putting up the posts for her game. He stood there in the road, waiting patiently as the sounds of battle and carnage echoed from deeper inside the town. Vivian caught herself holding her breath and let it out with a small yelp of fear. The man in the road turned to look in her direction, scanning the trees, before walking over towards her hiding place. Vivian jammed her hand tight against her mouth as tears streamed down her face. This was it. She would be found. It was over for her now. It was all her fault. They were by the jungle in the first place. She had been the one who wanted to get away from the gardens of the twins' estate. It was her fault that they were dead, and now she would join them. The man stooped outside of her hiding place, scanning the log and the boulder for any spaces to hide, his tanned face spattered with the blood of Analia, as he scanned with cold eyes that Vivian swore for a second flashed a deep red color. Vivian held her breath. Her only chance was to remain silent and wait, hoping and praying that he didn't find her hiding space. The man looked over everything once again before raising to his feet and turning back to his post by the road. Vivian quietly removed her hand from her mouth and let her breath out in a shaky breath. After that, she had no idea how long she hid there, waiting in the dark for someone to find her and slaughter her like the rest. but as she hid, she saw people being dragged out to the man. As each was made to kneel before him, he looked at them deep in the eye before nodding or shaking his head. Those that he rejected were thrown aside and kept under guard, while those he approved met their quick end as a blade was drawn across their throat, spilling their blood at his feet before their bodies were thrown aside as well into a separate pile. When they were done, the invaders turned to the group of survivors, the lord and lady among them, and spoke to them. Unable to hear their words, Vivian watched as the lord stood before them, his wife at his side, and waved his hand at the man, yelling and cursing him with some otherwise unheard words. The beast of a man gave a short chuckle before a flash of metal rocketed from his belt, and the lord's head dropped from his shoulders, rolling off down the street. Cleaning his blade in one fluid motion, the man holstered it, sheathing the blade that had once killed and would continue to kill over the course of the evening. As a gentle rain began to fall, as he turned and walked away from the group, and the lady of the town, cradling the now headless body of her husband, sat there weeping. Without words, the remainder of the invading archers let loose a volley of arrows into the crowd, knocking another and loosing them again before turning to follow their leader back off into the jungle, leaving the town in ruins and its people slaughtered. As the rain fell, growing more furious in power, Vivian waited for the last of these mysterious murderers to melt back into the shadow of the jungle. And as they did, she waited just a little bit longer, thinking of her parents. Surely they were dead. Surely they could not have survived. She must be an orphan now. How would she survive without them? She remembered her mother's loving face, the feeling of the calluses on her father's hands. How could they be gone? Wiping tears from her eyes, she felt the damp muck beneath her splash as rainwater filled her hiding spot. With a panic, she realized that she had forgotten about the rain, which now fell in heavy sheets. Turning to the spot that she had squeezed through to get under the rock, she found to her dismay that it was filling quickly with water. Rushing forward, she pushed herself under the water's surface in an attempt to squeeze her way out, feeling the tight space grip her like a cork in a bottle. Underwater now, and holding her breath, she panicked, thrashing wildly within the gap, trapped in a watery prison. Her refuge now her tomb if she couldn't find a way to get free. With the tear of her dress, the root that had snagged her, and the packed earth giving way, allowed her to squeeze from out of the log. Gasping for air as the clean rain cleared the muck from her face, she lay there for a moment, simply breathing and crying bitter tears of stress and fear, before standing shakily to her feet, her heart pounding. She must find her parents. Turning her attention to the road, she made her way back through the gap in the houses and stepped out into the muddy roadway. Taking a cautious step forward, she looked for them in the massive bodies from afar, but the heavy rains were too much to see through. She would have to get closer. Taking another tentative step, and then another, and another, she made her way to the pile. Tripping over something, she looked down to see the Lord's head lying in the muck at her feet. Her gorge rose, and as she looked away in disgust, even now she imagined his blood mixing with the mud that oozed between her toes. Stepping forward, she searched for her parents' faces and the fallen villagers, seeing only her neighbors and the citizens that she had lived with for years, not her parents. With a shudder, she turned to the pile of other bodies, those set aside by the man and his compatriots, killed on the spot. With a deep settling chill that pierced deeper than the rain, she walked forward towards the pile of bodies. Why had they been separated? What did they do to deserve this? She saw a familiar man's face, her uncle, eyes wide with fear as his throat slit still oozed in the rain. Suddenly a hand gripped her ankle and Vivian screamed. At her feet lay Ruby, clinging to life as she bled from her arrow wound. "It should have been you," she sputtered through the blood in her throat, her teeth stained red as she glared angrily up at Vivian. "Purple-eyed freak." Vivian was taken aback and stooped to help Ruby, but as she had uttered her final words, the girl had died. slumping deeper into the muddy dirt road that she had been so afraid to touch only hours prior. Pulling her ankle from the dead girl's grasp, Vivian turned to the pile of bodies, and looking closely realized that she recognized most all of them. They were her family, all purple-eyed men and women and children, totaling maybe 25 in all. She realized that this was a culling, a genocide, and the rest of the village was collateral damage. Hearing a twig snap in the jungle, just out of sight, Vivian took off sprinting through the sheets of rain into town, tears mixing with the warm rain that soaked her entire body. Making her way to the docks, she boarded her father's boat, pushing off from the dock as she saw figures sprinting through the rain after her. Ducking beneath the edge of her father's ship, she pulled the sails down to catch the wind, propelling her away from shore and out into the Blackwater Sea as arrows slammed into the hull of the ship before simply splashing into the sea as she got out of range. Standing, she saw the fire of the buildings consuming the other ships in the harbor, and the leaders of the invaders standing there at the end of the dock. This beast of a man made eye contact with her, and she glared angrily back at him, the man that had taken everything from her. Slowly, he raised his blade to her, the gesture making his intentions clear. They would meet again, and the thought both terrified and excited her. There on her father's ship, she vowed to herself that when the day came, she would be ready. Turning, she pulled the sails taut, propelling her vessel through the rain and across the waves, leaving behind the death and the jungle that harbored it for good.